The first night I spent alone in the old farmhouse, I told myself it was just the creaks and groans of an aging building settling into the earth. I had inherited the place from my grandfather, a man I barely knew, who had died quietly in his sleep a few months before. The house had sat empty for years before I decided to move in. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to get away from the noise and chaos of city life. But from the moment I pulled into the gravel driveway and stepped across the threshold, the house felt different, as if it were holding its breath. The farmhouse was perched at the edge of a dense patch of woods, the kind that locals called the Hollow. Stories about the Hollow were whispered in town. Strange disappearances, eerie lights, unexplainable sounds. I'd always dismissed them as folklore, but now, standing on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old pine. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot. I spent the first few hours unpacking, making the place feel like home. The power was spotty and the Wi-Fi barely reached the living room, but I was used to roughing it. I told myself that the silence was a blessing. No honking cars, no blaring televisions, just the quiet crackle of the fireplace. Around midnight, as I settled in with a book, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs, a soft tapping like fingernails on wood. The house was empty, I reminded myself, maybe a branch scraping against the window. I tried to focus on my reading, but the tapping persisted, growing slower and more deliberate. It moved from the hallway into a room at the end of the corridor. I didn't want to go investigate. Instead, I put on some music and tried to drown out the sound. Later that night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Heavy, slow steps pacing back and forth. I turned on the light, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. The door at the end was closed tight. I convinced myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was tired and alone in an unfamiliar place. Over the next few days, strange things began to accumulate. Doors left open that I was sure I'd closed, objects misplaced, a faint, sour smell that I couldn't locate. Sometimes I'd find the kitchen chairs pulled out as if someone had just stood up from the table. But the scariest thing was the mirror in the living room. At first glance, it was just an antique oval mirror with a tarnished brass frame. But every time I looked into it, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me, or a flash of a face that wasn't mine. I started avoiding it, but the reflections grew clearer, more insistent. One night, unable to sleep, I sat by the fireplace and tried to read. Suddenly, the room grew ice cold, my breath misting in the air. The fire sputtered and almost died out. I felt a presence, a weight pressing down on my chest. My eyes darted to the mirror. In its reflection, I saw her, a woman, pale and thin, standing silently behind me. Her eyes were dark pools, empty yet full of sorrow. She wore a tattered white dress, stained with something dark and old. She reached out a trembling hand, and her mouth opened, but no sound came. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. I gasped and spun around. Nothing. The next day, I asked around town about the house and its history. The librarian pulled out an old newspaper clipping for me. The story was brief and chilling. In 1923, a young woman named Evelyn lived in the house. She was known for her gentle nature, but was rumored to have suffered from severe depression. One bitter winter, she disappeared without a trace. Locals whispered that she had taken her own life somewhere on the property, though no body was ever found. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Could it be her? That night, I set up a voice recorder in the living room. I told myself it was nonsense, but if there was anything in the house, I wanted to know. Just before dawn, the recorder picked up a faint whisper. I played it back over and over. Help me. The voice was barely audible, almost drowned beneath the static. I couldn't stay there alone after that. I booked a room at a nearby motel and left the farmhouse empty for a few days. When I returned, a sense of unease settled over me once more. That's when things got worse. One evening, while preparing dinner, I heard footsteps again. This time they were heavier, slower, and coming from the attic. I'd never been up there since I moved in. The stairs creaked dangerously, and the door stuck tight. But the sound was unmistakable. Summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed the stairs with a flashlight. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes. I swept the beam of light around, heart hammering. And then, I saw it. A faded photograph pinned to the wooden wall. It was Evelyn, the woman from the newspaper. Her eyes seemed to follow me, pleading. Suddenly, a cold gust blew through the attic, extinguishing my flashlight. In the pitch black, I heard a soft sobbing, raw and heart-wrenching. I bolted down the stairs and out of the house, heart racing so hard I thought it would burst. The next morning, I called a local historian. She told me the house had a tragic past, built on land that was once a burial ground. Over the decades, many residents had reported strange sightings and unexplained phenomena, but no one stayed long. I had no choice but to face it. That night, I sat in the living room, the recorder on, the salt line across the doorway, and a candle burning low on the table. I whispered to Evelyn, telling her I wanted to help, that she wasn't alone. Hours passed. The temperature dropped again. I felt her presence, cold and sorrowful. Then a whisper, clear and pleading. Find me. In the following days, I searched the property. Behind the barn, under a pile of old stones, I found a small, rusted locket. Inside was a faded picture of Evelyn and a lock of hair. As I held it, the oppressive feeling lifted slightly. That night, the footsteps ceased. The tapping stopped. The mirror's reflection was empty. I stayed on, slowly making the farmhouse a home. I never saw Evelyn again, but sometimes late at night I catch the scent of lilacs, her favorite flower, according to the historian, carried on a gentle breeze through the open windows. And I feel somehow that she's finally at peace. Story the end. It started the night I moved into my new apartment. I had just finished a long day of packing and driving across the state. The place was a small, one-bedroom on the third floor of an older building in a quiet neighborhood. Cheap rent, decent enough neighborhood, and close to my new job. I was excited, but exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that makes you want to collapse the second you set foot inside. The building itself was old, the kind of place where the elevator creaked and the hallway lights flickered. But I figured it was normal for a place built in the 70s. I was prepared for that. What I wasn't prepared for was the feeling of being watched the moment I unlocked my apartment door. The key turned stiffly, and as I pushed the door open, the stale smell hit me, like old carpet mixed with something else, something musty and faintly metallic. I brushed it off, told myself it was just the place being empty for a few weeks. I dropped my bags and flicked on the light. The overhead bulb buzzed loudly, but worked. After unloading a few boxes, I made my way to the bedroom. It was small, but with the window open, the warm summer night air drifted in. I sat down on the bed, ready to unwind. That's when I first noticed it, a faint tapping sound coming from the wall behind the closet. I froze, listening. Tap, 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 tap. Soft, deliberate, not random, but too quiet to be anything obvious like plumbing or pipes. I moved closer, placing my ear against the drywall. The tapping stopped. I waited a minute. Nothing. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe a rat, but still that night I struggled to sleep. The dark corners of the room seemed to hold shadows that shifted when I blinked. The tapping returned once more around 2 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. I rolled over and tried to ignore it. The next day was filled with unpacking and organizing, trying to keep my mind off the odd noises. But every night, without fail, the tapping returned. Always the same rhythm. Sometimes it would come with a soft, whispering sound I couldn't make out, almost like breathing just beyond the wall. By the fourth night, I was on edge. I started leaving a small lamp on overnight. I even placed a recording app on my phone to catch the sounds. That night, the tapping became louder, more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. It went on for nearly 10 minutes straight. I was sitting up, heart racing, when the lamp flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, I heard it. A soft voice, barely a whisper, right next to my ear. Help me. I jumped up, flipping on every light in the room. Nothing. No one. The room was empty except for me. I played the recording the next morning. The tapping was there, clear as day, but the whisper was too faint to make out. I showed it to a coworker, and she suggested I contact the building manager. The manager was an older man named Mr. Collins. When I told him about the noises, he looked at me seriously, but didn't seem surprised. You're not the first, he said quietly. The previous tenant left after just 2 weeks, said the place was haunted or something. I pressed for more information. He told me the apartment had a history. About 10 years ago, a woman named Evelyn lived there. She'd gone missing without explanation. The police never found her. Rumor was she was last seen arguing with her boyfriend, who then disappeared too. I asked if there were any records or police reports I could read, but Mr. Collins said most files had been lost or destroyed over time. That night, I set up my phone to record again and prepared myself for whatever might happen. The tapping started at midnight, steady and slow. But then it changed. It wasn't just tapping anymore. The whispers grew louder, clearer. "Please," the voice breathed. "Find me." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. I wrapped myself in a blanket and whispered back, "Where are you?" There was a long silence. Then the tapping shifted towards the closet wall. The closet door was old, the paint peeling, and it stuck when I tried to open it. My hands trembled, but I pulled it open. Inside was nothing but a few old hangers and dust. But at the very back, the drywall looked different. Newer, less dusty, like someone had patched it recently. I grabbed a screwdriver from my toolbox and carefully pried at the drywall. After a few moments, a small square panel came loose, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside, I found a small old wooden box. I pulled the box out and opened it. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small photograph of a woman I assumed was Evelyn. The letters were dated from 10 years ago. I began reading. Evelyn wrote about her fear. Her boyfriend had become violent, threatening her. She was trapped, begging for help in her letters. The last letter was smeared with what looked like blood. My heart raced. I realized Evelyn had hidden these letters in the wall, hoping someone would find them. Suddenly, the room felt suffocating. The temperature dropped further. A shadow passed by the window, but when I looked, no one was there. I closed the closet door, box in hand, and sat on the bed. The tapping stopped. The whispers faded. The next day, I took the letters to the police station. The officers looked grim but promised to reopen the case. That night, I slept soundly for the first time. The apartment was quiet. No tapping, no whispers. But then, a week later, I was awoken by the sound of footsteps pacing the hallway outside my door. Slow, measured, deliberate. I looked at the clock, 3:13 a.m. I held my breath as the footsteps stopped. I felt a presence just beyond the door. Then a soft knock. One knock. Pause. Two knocks. I didn't answer. The next morning, I found the small wooden box resting on my kitchen table, even though I was sure I had locked it inside the closet. I never stayed in that apartment after the police reopened Evelyn's case. I moved away as soon as I could. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the tapping, the whisper, and those slow footsteps outside my door. Story the end. The first night I stayed alone in that old house, I thought I had made a mistake. It was a rental property I found after moving to a small town for work. A quiet place with a decent price and lots of character. The previous tenant had moved out suddenly, and the landlord was eager to fill the vacancy. The house was built in the 1920s, full of creaky floors, uneven walls, and the kind of drafty windows that let in the cold no matter how tightly you closed them. I didn't really believe in ghosts. I never had, not seriously. But that first night alone, I started to question what I thought I knew. I arrived in the early evening, moving my few belongings inside under the dim light of a fading sunset. The air smelled like damp wood and old plaster. I set up my bed in the bedroom on the second floor and decided to take a quick shower before settling in for the night. The plumbing was old but functional, which was a relief. After dinner, I turned on the TV, but the channels were fuzzy and the volume cut in and out. I figured the antenna was old and would have to do without. I turned it off and pulled out a book. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go to bed, telling myself I just needed to get used to the place. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle. There were the usual noises, creaks and groans, a faint whistle from the wind outside. Nothing unusual for an old house. But then, around midnight, I heard something else, a faint tapping. At first I thought it was rain on the window, but the night was clear. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I froze, holding my breath. The tapping stopped. I lay still, heart pounding. Then, softly, footsteps. Light and slow, moving down the hallway away from my room. I wanted to convince myself it was the house, but the sound was too distinct. I hadn't heard footsteps that slow and measured before. I didn't have any visitors, and the front door was locked tight. For the next hour, I stayed awake, every nerve on edge. Whenever I close my eyes, I imagine something standing just outside my door, waiting. Around 1:30 a.m., I finally drifted off. The next morning, I told myself it was just nerves, the unfamiliarity of being alone in a new place. The second night was worse. After dinner, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checked the locks. I kept the lights on and tried to watch a movie. But around 11 p.m., the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness. I lit some candles and moved carefully through the house, checking the fuse box in the basement. The neighbors said the power was out in the whole area and that the electric company was working on it. I went back upstairs, feeling uneasy in the dim candlelight. That's when I heard it again. A low, dragging sound coming from the floor below my bedroom. It was slow and steady, like someone was pulling a heavy object across the wooden floor. I swallowed hard and stayed silent, clutching the candle. The sound grew louder, moving closer to the stairs. Suddenly, the candle flickered violently and went out. Total darkness. I scrambled to relight it, but my hands were shaking so badly the match broke. I managed to light another, the small flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. The dragging sound had stopped. I stayed in my room the rest of the night, not daring to move. The third night was the breaking point. I had decided I wouldn't spend another night alone. But by the time I thought of staying somewhere else, the sun had set, and I was already trapped. I made sure to lock the doors and windows again. The power was still out. I sat in the living room, candles around me like a fragile fortress. Around 11:45 p.m., the temperature dropped suddenly. The room felt icy cold. My breath came out in small puffs of mist. The candles flickered again, struggling against a breeze I couldn't feel. Then I heard a whisper. Faint and unintelligible, it came from the corner of the room near the staircase. I froze, listening. The whispering grew louder, almost urgent. The words still didn't make sense, but the tone was pleading. I tried to stand to leave the room, but my legs were locked in place. Then a shadow passed at the top of the stairs. No, it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, tall and thin, with long, ragged clothes that seemed to shift and blur. Its face was hidden in darkness, but the feeling it gave me was icy dread. I blinked. The figure was gone. I bolted for the front door and yanked it open. Outside, the air was cold but clear. The stars shone bright. I looked back toward the house. The front window on the second floor, my bedroom window, had a faint light flickering inside, even though all my candles were blown out. I left that night. Days later, I called the landlord. He told me the previous tenant left without explanation, claiming the house was haunted. He mentioned strange noises, lights turning on and off by themselves, and feelings of being watched. I never went back. Story, the end. The night had settled over the city like a thick, suffocating blanket. The streets outside my apartment were silent, save for the occasional distant siren or the low hum of a passing car. I had just moved into this place, a modest second-floor unit in an aging brick building downtown. The rent was affordable and the location was convenient, close to work, shops, and the subway. I was excited, though a little uneasy. The building had an old feel to it, creaking with every gust of wind and settling with faint groans that echoed through the empty hallways. I was alone. My roommate had moved out unexpectedly earlier that week, and I hadn't found a replacement yet. So tonight, it was just me and the shadows. I'd spent the day unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and trying to make the place feel like home. The evening had slipped by quickly, and now, with the clock nudging past midnight, I was winding down. The only light came from a small desk lamp in the corner of the living room, casting long, jittery shadows against the peeling wallpaper. I settled on the couch with a book, but my mind wandered too much to focus. I kept glancing at the hallway that led to the bedroom, the bathroom, and the closet. It was a narrow corridor, and the faint yellow glow from the living room barely touched its depths. The first thing I noticed was a smell. Faint, but unmistakable. It was like old wood mixed with something metallic, like the smell of a basement that hadn't been aired out in years. I didn't think much of it at first. Old buildings have their quirks. Still, I wrinkled my nose and decided to open the window for a little fresh air. The cool night breeze flowed in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and something else, something earthy and decayed. I closed the window after a few minutes, and as I did, I heard a soft thud from somewhere inside the apartment. I froze. There's nothing in this place but me. I set my book down carefully and stood up, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it must have been a box settling or a loose panel shifting. I started toward the hallway to investigate. Halfway there, the lights flickered once and then went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. The desk lamp blinked off, and I was left with only the pale glow of the streetlights filtering in through the window. My heart began to race. I reached for my phone on the couch and turned on the flashlight app. The beam cut a swath through the dark, illuminating the edge of the hallway. I moved slowly down the corridor. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, its dark interior looking like a yawning mouth. I flicked the light inside. Nothing. No movement. No sounds. I moved on to the bedroom door. It was closed. I reached out and turned the knob gently. The door creaked open, revealing my small bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, nothing was out of place. I closed the door again and started back toward the living room. That's when I heard it. A whisper. So faint I almost missed it. "Help me." My breath caught in my throat. I shone the light toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from the closet door at the end of the hall. The closet was a narrow, cramped space with a sliding wooden door. I never used it much except for coats and some storage boxes. I stepped closer. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. "Please." I swallowed hard, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced through all the logical explanations. Maybe a neighbor below was playing a trick. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after the long day. But the voice sounded so real, so desperate. I hesitated, then slid the closet door open. Inside, the small space was empty, except for a few boxes stacked in the corner. The smell was stronger here, a mix of damp wood, mold, and something metallic again. I leaned in and touched one of the boxes. As I did, the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath fog up in the cold air. I pulled my hand back, startled. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, banging on the door with my fists. "Hey! Let me out!" The air grew thick, heavy, as if the room itself was pressing in on me. And then, in the darkness, I heard the voice again. Louder now. "Don't leave me." Panic surged through me. I tried the door again. It wouldn't budge. I pounded harder, calling for help. My phone was outside on the bed. I sank to the floor, breath ragged. Minutes passed. Then the door slid open slowly. I stumbled out, gasping. The apartment was still. The lights flickered back on. I collapsed on the couch, heart racing, and tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream. But over the next few days, strange things kept happening. Lights flickering without explanation, cold spots appearing in random corners, the faint metallic smell growing stronger. Sometimes I'd hear the whisper again, always coming from the closet. I did some digging online and found that my building was once a boarding house, and decades ago, a young woman named Clara had died mysteriously in an apartment on my floor. No one knew exactly how, but rumors said she was trapped, desperate to get out. I never told anyone about what happened in the closet, but each night I dreaded going to sleep. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye, a shadowy woman, pale and thin, standing just inside the closet, reaching out. One night, I gathered the courage to open the closet door and speak out loud. "Clara, I hear you. I want to help." The whisper came back immediately. "Please." I spent hours researching, calling old city records, trying to find any clues. Eventually, I discovered that Clara's death had been ruled accidental, but there were reports of foul play that were ignored at the time. One night, armed with nothing but a candle and my resolve, I left the closet door wide open and sat quietly nearby. The apartment grew cold, and then the whispers started, filling the room. "Help me. Free me." I closed my eyes and said a prayer, hoping to bring peace. The temperature slowly rose, the air felt lighter, and then, just before dawn, the whispering stopped. From that night on, the cold spots disappeared. The metallic smell faded away. The shadows no longer lurked. But sometimes late at night, I still feel a gentle presence, as if Clara is there, watching, grateful. I've never forgotten the night I was alone in that apartment with a ghost who just wanted to be heard. Story. The end. The night was still and quiet as Arif locked the front door of his apartment building behind him. The streets of Dhaka had long emptied, the usual hum of city life reduced to distant echoes. Arif's job at the local newspaper had him working late shifts more often than not, and tonight was no different. His office was small, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the building, with just one narrow window overlooking the empty alley behind. He liked the solitude the night shift brought, the way the world slowed down, even if the hours stretched on endlessly. It was around 11:45 p.m. when the lights flickered for the first time. The building was old, with wiring that had seen better days, so he didn't think much of it. Arif sat at his desk, typing away on his laptop, editing articles for the morning edition. The quiet tapping of his keyboard was the only sound in the room aside from the low hum of the air conditioner. The flicker lasted a second and then the lights stabilized. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight. Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to drop sharply. Arif pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. It wasn't uncommon for the air conditioning to malfunction, but this felt different. There was a heavy stillness in the room, like the kind that presses down on your chest when you're alone, and something unseen is watching. He shook his head, blaming fatigue and too many cups of tea. Then he heard it, a soft, dragging sound from the corridor outside his office door. It was faint, like footsteps dragging on the rough concrete floor. Arif froze, staring at the door. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving closer with each scraping step. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Hello?" he called out cautiously, voice cracking in the silence. No answer. Just the dragging sound stopped abruptly. He waited, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the door. After what felt like an eternity, he stood up and walked over, opening the door slowly. The hallway was empty. The building's dim emergency lights cast long shadows, but there was no sign of anyone. The silence was deafening. Arif shook his head. "Get a grip, Arif." He muttered to himself and went back inside. He locked the door behind him and sat down again, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. The computer screen suddenly flickered and went black. "Not now," he groaned, trying to restart the machine, but the screen stayed dark. A sharp knock sounded at the window beside his desk. Arif jumped. He turned to see the dark alley outside, empty as always. No cars, no people, just the flickering street lamp casting erratic shadows. He blinked, heart hammering. The knock came again, louder this time, like someone tapping on the glass with their knuckles. He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and shone it out. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing but the empty alley. He shook his head, laughing nervously. Probably a rat or something. He sat back down and tried to reboot the computer, but it refused to start. The air grew colder still, a chill creeping under his skin. He wrapped his jacket tighter, trying to keep the unease at bay. Then he noticed something on the window. A handprint. Not a clean print, but smeared, like someone had pressed their palm hard against the glass and slid it down. The dirt and grime of the alley made the shape visible in the dim light. Arif's breath caught. He flicked the flashlight up and down the alley, but there was no sign of anyone. He felt a sudden urge to leave, to get out of the building altogether. But the elevator was broken for weeks, and the stairs were at the other end of the corridor. It would take him nearly 10 minutes to get outside. He debated his options. The office phone line was dead too, probably cut or malfunctioning. He was truly alone. He turned back to the desk, fuming silently. Suddenly, the handprint on the window started to move. No, not move. It seemed to stretch, elongate like shadows in the moonlight. It grew larger, darkening, turning into a smudge of something unnatural. Arif rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, the handprint had vanished. A sudden banging erupted at the window. Harder, more urgent. He jumped up and scrambled to the door, locked it quickly, and pulled the curtains tight. The banging didn't stop. "Stop it!" he yelled, voice cracking. But the noise continued, a relentless pounding like someone desperate to get in. His phone buzzed. He looked down to see a message. But it wasn't from anyone he knew. The screen showed just 3 words: "I'm inside." His blood ran cold. He dropped the phone. The banging stopped immediately. He looked up, heart racing. Then a whisper came from the darkness behind him, a voice so faint it was barely audible but unmistakably close. "Why did you lock me out?" Arif spun around. Nothing, just the empty room, the flickering lights, and the oppressive silence. He ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked on the handle again and again. Panic set in. Suddenly, the lights went out entirely. Complete darkness. His phone lay dead on the floor. No signal, no light, nothing. He reached for the flashlight again, but it was gone. He was trapped. He could feel a presence. Cold, heavy, suffocating, something breathing just behind him. He dared not turn. Minutes passed like hours. Then a cold hand grasped his shoulder. He screamed, spun around, and there it was. A figure, barely visible in the blackness, pale and translucent. Its eyes hollow, empty, staring. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. It reached forward. Arif stumbled back, crashing into the desk. The lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. The door was unlocked. He ran out. He never returned to that office again. Months later, he heard from a friend that the building was being torn down, and that, years ago, a man had died in that very office, alone during a night shift. A security guard who vanished mysteriously without explanation. Arif still wakes up some nights, heart pounding, hearing the dragging footsteps and the knocking on the window. Sometimes he wonders if the man was still trying to get out. Or maybe he was trying to get in. Story the end. The house had been empty for nearly a year before I moved in. It was a small, two-story Victorian on the edge of town, a fixer-upper, but the kind of place you didn't mind fixing. I bought it cheap, figuring I'd do the renovations myself, little by little, and maybe turn a small profit when I sold it down the line. What I didn't expect was that I'd be living there alone at night, encountering things that felt off, the kind of things you don't really believe in until you're staring at them in the dark. It started on the very first night. I arrived just after sunset. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something older. Dust, mold, maybe. I'd been out all day, hauling paint cans and tools into the house, and was exhausted. The sun slipped away as I stood in the front doorway, key in hand, feeling that old house thrill mixed with a prickling unease. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop. Not dramatically, no frost on the windows or breath hanging in the air, just a subtle shift, like the house was colder inside than outside. The heating system was broken, but that didn't explain the chill in the foyer. The house was silent, except for the faint creaks of settling wood. I flipped the lights on, but only the ceiling fixture in the foyer worked. The rest were either burned out or disconnected. I made a mental note to check the wiring the next day. I set down my bag and started exploring, flashlight in hand, noting where I'd need to patch plaster or replace floorboards. Everything was coated in dust and cobwebs, a house frozen in time. I headed upstairs to the bedroom that would be mine. As I pushed open the door, the wood groaned beneath my weight, and a sudden draft brushed past my neck. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the house breathing. I shrugged it off and started unpacking a few essentials, planning to crash early. Before I turned off the lights, I glanced at the old mirror hanging on the wall opposite my bed. The glass was streaked and smudged, but in its murky reflection, I caught movement, a shadow crossing the hallway behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the softest whispering, just beyond the thin walls. I couldn't make out words, just breathy voices curling through the dark. I sat up, heart pounding, but the room was still. No TV, no radio, nothing that could explain the sounds. I convinced myself it was the wind moving through the old vents. Weeks passed. Every night the same, whispering voices I couldn't understand, footsteps pacing just outside my door, sometimes faint knocking, always gentle but deliberate. During the day, nothing seemed out of place. No signs of intruders, no broken locks or open windows. Just the house, quiet and still. One evening, while repainting the hallway, I found a small trapdoor behind a loose baseboard near the stairwell. It was hidden and old, the paint chipped and yellowed around the edges. Curious, I pried it open and discovered a narrow crawl space leading beneath the floorboards. It smelled damp and musty, the air thick with decay. I shone my flashlight down into the darkness and saw the faint outline of wooden beams and old bricks. No signs of anything living. But as I closed the trapdoor and stood up, I felt something brush against my ankle. Cold and feather light, like a breath. I glanced down. Nothing. That night, the voices were louder, more urgent. I swear I heard my name called softly, again and again, dragging me into the darkness. The footsteps became quicker, pacing back and forth from one end of the hallway to the other. I started sleeping with a knife on my bedside table. One night, as I tried to drown the sounds with music, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Why did you come?" I froze. My fingers trembled as I typed back, "Who is this?" No reply. The next day, I went to the local library to research the house's history. I found the old records in the archives. The house was built in 1893, owned initially by a family named Calloway. According to an old newspaper clipping, the daughter, Clara Calloway, had died in the house in 1907 at age 12 under mysterious circumstances. The papers mentioned a fire in the nursery, but there were no details about what happened. I felt a chill reading about the girl's death. The nursery was the room right next to my bedroom. That evening, I inspected the nursery. The door was locked, with a rusted keyhole and thick wood. I forced it open with a crowbar. Inside, dust motes floated in the fading light. The fireplace was blackened with soot, and the wallpaper was scorched in places. Broken doll pieces were scattered across the floor. As I moved deeper into the room, I heard the soft creak of the rocking chair. I spun around, but it sat still. Then a faint giggle echoed in the air, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. I fled back to my room, locking the door. The nights after that became worse. The whispers turned into cries and sobbing. I'd wake up to the rocking chair moving slowly back and forth in the nursery next door. Doors slammed shut without wind. Lights flickered, plunging me into darkness for seconds that felt like hours. One night, after hours of crying that sounded like a child begging for help, I called out, voice shaking, "Clara? What do you want from me?" Silence. Then a soft voice whispered in my ear, "Stay." I jumped out of bed, swinging the light around the room. No one. Suddenly my phone lit up again, this time a picture message. It was a grainy photo, apparently taken from the staircase looking down the hall. In the dark hallway, a small figure stood, illuminated faintly in the camera flash. It was a little girl in a white dress, eyes hollow and wide, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. I dropped the phone and backed away. The figure moved, just a fraction, closer. Terrified, I ran to the front door and grabbed my keys, ready to leave. But as I turned, I saw her, Clara, standing at the bottom of the stairs, pale as a ghost, staring up at me. Her eyes weren't empty anymore. They were pleading, desperate. I froze. She raised a small hand and pointed toward the nursery. I followed, trembling. Inside, the fireplace was still blackened, but now the smell of smoke was stronger. On the hearth lay a small, charred doll. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the flames flickered without fire. Clara's voice whispered again, "Help me." I looked around, noticing a small, loose floorboard near the fireplace. I pried it open and found a rusted tin box beneath. Inside were letters, a collection of desperate writings from a mother, begging for her daughter's safety. The last letter mentioned a man who had been abusing Clara and her desperate attempt to protect her from him, locking her in the nursery during a fire that broke out. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me, locking itself. I pounded on the door, screaming. The temperature dropped so fast my breath frosted in front of me. Then a hand touched my shoulder. I turned to see Clara, tears streaming down her ghostly face. "I'm free now," she whispered. The door clicked open. I fled the house that night and never returned. Months later, I sold the house to someone else, but sometimes late at night, I still hear the whisper of a little girl asking me not to leave her alone. Story the end. The job was supposed to be straightforward. Overnight security at a small historic museum on the outskirts of town. I was fresh out of college, in need of something part-time while I figured out my next steps, and the pay was good enough for me to say yes without asking too many questions. The museum was a converted old mansion, sprawling over 2 floors with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and exhibits ranging from antique furniture to artifacts from local history. Most nights, it was just me and the silence. On my first night, I was given a quick tour by the day shift guard, a middle-aged man named Paul who looked like he hadn't slept much in years. He handed me a large set of keys, a walkie-talkie, and a flashlight. The place was mostly locked down, with only a few rooms open for visitors during the day. My job was simple: monitor the security cameras, make rounds every 2 hours, and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Easy enough. The building felt heavy with history. The kind that wasn't just in the exhibits, but seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Paul mentioned that some visitors and staff reported strange noises or odd feelings, but he shrugged it off as the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling at night. I settled into the security office, which was a small room near the main entrance, walls lined with monitors showing grainy black and white feeds from cameras in various rooms and hallways. For the first few hours, nothing happened beyond the occasional flicker of a camera or a groan from the building's heating system. Around midnight, I decided to start my rounds. The museum was dark except for emergency exit signs casting an eerie red glow. My flashlight cut through the shadows as I walked slowly through the exhibits. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and every little sound seemed amplified in the silence. When I reached the second floor, I paused outside the portrait gallery. The faces in the paintings seemed to watch me as I passed, their eyes reflecting the flashlight beam in a way that made my skin crawl. I laughed nervously and moved on. About an hour into my rounds, I heard it, a soft whispering coming from one of the closed exhibit rooms. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the building's old ventilation system. I stopped, listening. The whispering grew a little louder, but I couldn't make out any words. I approached the door slowly, hand on the handle. The room was one that had been closed to the public due to fragile artifacts, so it was supposed to be locked. To my surprise, the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with my flashlight raised. Inside, the air was cold and stale. The faint whispering stopped abruptly. I scanned the room with my light, dusty shelves lined with old books and documents, a few display cases empty except for cobwebs. Nothing seemed out of place. Shaking my head, I closed the door and locked it securely. Back at the security office, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just the building playing tricks, or maybe a prank by one of the daytime staff who'd forgotten to lock the door properly. The next night was similar, quiet, with only the occasional bump or creak. But then, around 2 a.m., things changed. The monitors suddenly flickered, and the feed from the portrait gallery went static. I pressed the buttons to reset the camera, but it stayed dark. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs to check. When I arrived, the room was exactly as I had left it, except the lights overhead were off. I moved my flashlight beam slowly across the room and noticed something chilling. The large portrait of the museum's founder, an imposing man with piercing eyes, was missing from the wall. The empty space where the portrait had hung was surrounded by tiny scratches in the paint. My heart hammered as I turned to leave, but then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the hallway. I spun around, shining the light down the corridor. Nothing. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence answered. Rushing back downstairs, I checked the security footage again. The portrait gallery camera was still offline, but I noticed movement on another monitor, the hallway outside the room. A shadow passed quickly, just out of clear view. I reported the missing portrait to the day shift manager the next morning, but they told me it had never been moved, and no one else had access to that area. The museum was closed for renovations in that wing, and only a handful of staff held keys. That afternoon, a crew came to reinstall the portrait and inspect the room for damage. They found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to explain the scratches or the missing painting. The next few nights were a blur of tension and sleeplessness. I started hearing whispers again, soft voices calling my name just beyond the edge of hearing. Doors that I had locked were found unlocked. The temperature dropped suddenly in certain rooms, my breath fogging in the cold air. One night, as I sat in the security office, I saw something on the monitor that made my blood run cold. The camera facing the main staircase showed a figure, tall, pale, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, slowly descending the stairs. The figure's face was blurred, but I could tell it was looking directly at the camera. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the stairs, but the figure was gone by the time I reached the bottom. I searched the entire floor, calling out, but only the silence answered. I started researching the museum's history, desperate for an explanation. I learned that the mansion had belonged to a wealthy family in the late 1800s. The founder was a man named Charles Whitaker, known for his harsh demeanor and mysterious disappearance one night after a terrible storm. Some rumors said he had died on the property, others whispered of darker fates. A staff member told me about a long-standing legend that the founder's spirit haunted the building, unable to rest, watching over the artifacts he had collected. My skepticism was fading fast. One particularly cold night, I was on my rounds when the power went out suddenly. The entire building was plunged into darkness except for the emergency lights casting long red shadows down the hallways. I fumbled for my flashlight, heart pounding. As I moved through the dark corridors, I heard footsteps again, closer this time. The slow, deliberate sound echoed behind me. I spun around, shining the beam, but found nothing but empty hallways. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just nerves. Reaching the grand ballroom, I stopped dead in my tracks. The faint sound of a piano playing drifted through the air. The instrument itself was old and covered in dust, untouched for decades. The melody was haunting, soft, melancholic. I stood frozen, listening as the music slowly faded away. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I whipped around, flashlight beam shaking wildly, but no one was there. I ran back to the security office, locked the door behind me, and sat trembling in the dark. I called Paul, the day guard, and begged him to come in early. He arrived before dawn, looking pale but unsurprised. "That place," he said quietly, "it gets to you. The past isn't done with this house." I never worked another night shift there. Even now, months later, I get chills remembering those nights, the whispers, the cold touches, the music that no one else heard. Sometimes, when I pass the museum during the day, I catch a glimpse of a shadow at the window, watching. I don't know if it was Charles Whitaker's restless spirit or something else entirely, but I know one thing. Some places are never truly empty. Story the end. The late night hours had always been a struggle for me, but working the graveyard shift at the old community library was supposed to be straightforward. I liked the quiet, the rows of books, and the gentle hum of the air conditioner, keeping the musty air at bay. The library was built in the 1920s, a sturdy brick building with tall windows and an imposing oak door. It had character, and to a history buff like me, it was the perfect place to work. That was before the nights started getting strange. My first few weeks were uneventful. I would arrive at 10 p.m., sign in, and spend the night shelving books, helping with inventory, or cataloging new acquisitions. The day staff left at 8 p.m., and the library settled into silence except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors or the distant sounds of the city winding down. I wasn't afraid of being alone there. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude. But then, around the end of the first month, I noticed it. A cold draft that seemed to pass through the eastern wing, near the archives room. The building was old, sure, and drafty in places, but this was different. It was sudden and sharp, like someone had cracked open a window in the dead of winter. I would feel the chill wrap around me, even when the thermostats read a steady 68 degrees. One night, about 2 weeks after I first felt the cold, I was working late in the archives room. This section of the library was filled with old newspapers, fragile documents, and leather-bound books. The air smelled heavier here, like dust and time itself. I was indexing a collection of letters from local residents dating back to the early 1900s when I heard the soft sound of footsteps. I froze, glancing toward the door. It was closed. I was alone. I told myself it was just the building settling, a floorboard shifting beneath me. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside the room. I stood up and walked out into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty. I checked the main lobby and all the offices. No one was there. The only sound was my own breath coming out in small puffs of condensation in the cold air. Shrugging it off, I returned to the archives. As I sat back down, I noticed a book had slid off a nearby shelf and lay open on the floor. The pages were yellowed and fragile, and as I bent down to pick it up, I caught the faint scent of lavender. I shook my head. There was no one else here, and no flowers had been brought in. That was the start of it. Over the next few nights, things escalated slowly but surely. Doors would creak open on their own, lights flickered, and sometimes I would hear whispering voices when I was alone in the stacks. The voices were unintelligible, soft and hurried, as if spoken just beneath the threshold of hearing. One evening, while shelving books near the history section, I saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye. It was fleeting, a figure dressed in early 20th century clothing, a long skirt and blouse, her hair pinned up. When I turned fully, she was gone. The cold draft swept past me again. My skin crawled. I began researching the history of the library and the surrounding neighborhood. Local archives revealed a story about a young woman named Eleanor, who had worked as a librarian here in the 1920s. Eleanor was beloved by the community, but had vanished mysteriously one winter night. Her body never found. Rumors said she had been searching for a rare book rumored to contain secrets of the town's founding, and some believed she had been trapped in the library by a fire that never officially happened. With each night I spent alone there, I felt more connected to Eleanor's presence. I began to hear her footsteps clearly, almost like someone pacing anxiously, or soft sighs that echoed through the tall bookshelves. One night, the lights in the archives room flickered violently before going out completely. In the pitch black, I felt a gentle hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. I ran out to the lobby, heart hammering. That night, I resolved to leave the library after my shift, but the front door was locked tight. The usual mechanism was jammed, no matter how I tried to open it. I fumbled for my phone to call the building manager, but there was no signal inside the thick walls. As I stood there, the temperature dropped drastically. A whisper floated through the room, clear and urgent. "Find it." I didn't know what it was. I tried to calm myself, but the whispering grew louder, surrounding me like a swarm. I heard footsteps descending the staircase from the upper floors. I couldn't tell if they were coming toward me or receding. A soft, sorrowful voice echoed faintly, "Help me." The lights flickered back on, and the door to the lobby suddenly clicked open. I bolted outside and didn't stop running until I reached my car. The city felt surreal, the streetlights hazy through my tears. The next day, I decided to investigate Eleanor's disappearance further. I found a mention in an old newspaper clipping of a book called The Chronicle of Shadows, a rare manuscript said to be hidden somewhere in the library. It was rumored to be linked to the town's founders and held secrets some wanted buried. Driven by equal parts fear and curiosity, I spent my next night's shift hunting for the book. I searched the archives, the stacks, even the locked basement, which the staff rarely accessed. In the basement, amid the dust and cobwebs, I found a loose floorboard near the wall. Beneath it was a small metal box, rusted but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the manuscript, its leather cover cracked and pages brittle. As I touched the book, a cold wave rushed over me. The air around me seemed to pulse with energy. I opened the manuscript carefully. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, cryptic symbols, and descriptions of strange rituals performed by the town's founders. Suddenly, the basement lights went out and the temperature plunged. The whispering voices returned, frantic and insistent. I tried to leave, but the basement door slammed shut. Panic set in. I pounded on the door and shouted for help, but no one answered. The whispers surrounded me, the cold air pressing in. In the darkness, a pale figure appeared, Eleanor. Her eyes were wide with terror, lips mouthing the words, "Protect it." I held the manuscript close. The figure reached toward me, and I felt an overwhelming sadness mixed with urgency. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. The basement door creaked open. I ran upstairs, clutching the manuscript. I locked the basement door behind me and sealed it with a heavy shelf. From that night on, the presence felt less hostile. The footsteps slowed, the whispers softened to a gentle hum. It was as if Eleanor's spirit was finally at peace, relieved that the book had been found and protected. I never saw her again, but sometimes when I worked late, I felt a comforting chill, like a protective presence watching over me. The library remained an eerie place, but no longer threatening. Instead, it felt like a place of memory, a place where the past whispered softly, waiting to be remembered. And I knew that some secrets, once uncovered, could finally rest. Story, the end. The wind had been howling for hours by the time I realized I was truly alone. It was a cold autumn night in the middle of October, the kind of night where the trees outside creaked and groaned, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. I had just moved into the small house on the outskirts of town, a place I had bought on a whim, eager for a fresh start after a messy breakup and years of city noise. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, with thick wooden floors and high ceilings that made sounds echo in strange ways. I had been living there for a little over a week, and the previous nights had been quiet enough, if a bit unnerving, with the occasional unexplained creak or moan from the walls. That night, however, was different. It started with the power flickering at around 10 p.m. A brief blackout that sent the lights out for a few seconds before snapping back on. I was alone in the living room, curled up with a book, the only sound the crackle of the fireplace and the rustle of pages. When the lights returned, I noticed the air had turned noticeably colder, though I hadn't opened any windows or doors. I set my book down and stood up, rubbing my arms to shake the chill. The silence was thick, and for the first time I noticed that the house didn't just creak, it sighed. A deep, low sound like breath escaping from the walls themselves. I told myself it was the old pipes or the house settling, and tried to focus on the TV, but the screen was static as if it had lost signal. The clock on the wall flickered and then stopped. The hands froze at 10:07. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the kitchen. It was soft at first, barely audible over the roar of the wind outside, but it grew louder. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was deliberate, like someone knocking, but I was alone. I swallowed hard, telling myself maybe it was just a branch hitting the window. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. As I entered, the tapping stopped. I flicked on the light. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. I checked the windows. Closed and locked. The cupboards, the drawers, the refrigerator door, all shut tight. I exhaled slowly and laughed nervously. "Get a grip," I whispered. I turned to leave when the overhead light flickered again and went out, plunging me into darkness. My heart leapt into my throat. I fumbled for my phone on the counter, but the battery icon flashed red. Damn. I wasn't prepared. Suddenly, the faint tapping resumed, but this time it was coming from behind me. I spun around, phone light barely illuminating the dark room, and saw the kitchen door at the far end creak open slowly. I froze. I hadn't opened that door. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I wanted to call someone, but my phone was dying fast, and the cellular signal was weak here. I backed out of the kitchen and shut the door behind me, pressing my back against it as if that would keep whatever it was away. The house felt alive, watching, breathing. I made my way back to the living room, deciding to sit tight until morning. As I settled on the couch, a shadow flickered across the far wall, too fast to be my own. I held my breath and scanned the room. Nothing. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, heavy, measured. I live alone. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a loose board or a branch on the roof, but the footsteps were deliberate, pacing back and forth directly above me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The footsteps stopped abruptly, then a whisper. So faint I thought I imagined it. But it came again. A soft, breathy voice saying my name, Emily. I don't know why I told you my name, but I did. It was as if the voice knew it, calling me, pulling me toward the stairs. I sat frozen for what felt like hours. The whispering continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, always saying, Emily. I finally gathered enough courage to stand and slowly walk toward the staircase. The air grew colder with each step. At the landing, I shone my phone's dying light up the hallway. The bedroom door at the end was slightly ajar. I moved closer, the whispering louder now, almost a pleading. I pushed the door open fully and shined my light inside. The room was empty except for the bed, neatly made. Then I noticed the window, open, curtains billowing in the cold night air. I closed it and latched it tightly. When I turned back, the room had changed. There, on the floor by the bed, was a small, old-fashioned music box. I didn't remember seeing it before. I knelt and picked it up. The surface was cold, the wood worn. I opened it. A haunting melody filled the room. I dropped the box in shock and saw her, standing in the corner, a pale figure, a woman in a long, tattered dress. Her eyes were hollow, dark wells of sadness. She looked right at me and whispered one last time, "Help me." I screamed and ran out of the house, the music box's tune chasing me down the stairs. I never went back. Days later, I learned from the neighbors that a woman had died in that house nearly a century ago. A woman named Margaret, who was said to have been locked away by her family for reasons no one fully understood. The house still stands empty, and sometimes at night, the neighbors say they hear a music box playing softly, drifting on the wind. I don't blame them for staying away, because I know what's still inside. Story the end. It was late autumn when I started the new job. The kind of job that doesn't pay much, but pays just enough to keep the lights on and the fridge stocked. I worked as a night security guard at an old office building downtown, one of those brick, multi-story buildings built in the 1920s that still hadn't been modernized. The kind of place with a creaky elevator, long, dimly lit corridors, and a basement that smelled like damp concrete and forgotten files. The building had been partially vacant for years, and the company that hired me was trying to save money by having a single guard watch over the whole thing after hours. My shifts were from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. alone, with just a radio and a flashlight for company. The job was mostly routine: check doors, make sure windows were locked, keep an eye on security cameras, and report any disturbances. The janitor would come through in the early morning, so I'd usually be alone for the majority of the night. The first few nights were uneventful. I walked the halls, flipped switches, and caught up on podcasts on my phone. The old building creaked and groaned like an ancient ship, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. I was used to quiet places. Having lived in a small apartment near a busy street, the silence was almost a relief. But by the end of the first week, things started to change. It began with small sounds, distant tapping, faint whispers that seemed to float through the air vents. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway behind me. The floor above was supposed to be empty, but I could hear the distinct sound of boots on wood. I spun around with my flashlight, but the hallway was empty and still. I chalked it up to my imagination, nerves maybe. After all, I was working alone in a dark, nearly abandoned building. The second week, I noticed the security cameras acting weird. One camera in particular, in a narrow hallway leading to the basement stairs, would occasionally flicker and go static. Sometimes, when I looked at the feed, I thought I could see a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall just beyond the camera's reach. But when I physically checked the area, nothing was there. The basement was always my least favorite part. Cold, damp, and filled with dusty filing cabinets and broken furniture. I was never quite comfortable going down there, especially alone, but it was part of my rounds, so I forced myself. One night, while walking the basement, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, so sharp I could see my breath. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and I thought I heard a voice whisper something just out of earshot. I froze. My skin prickled, and for a moment, I considered running up the stairs and never coming back. But the job had to be done. A few nights later, the strangest thing happened. I was monitoring the security cameras in the office when I saw movement near the entrance lobby. The timestamp read 3:33 a.m. I radioed the front desk, but they told me the lobby was supposed to be locked tight. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the front doors. As I approached, I could hear faint footsteps again, slow, deliberate. When I pushed open the door, nothing was there. The street was deserted and silent, no signs of forced entry. The glass doors were locked from the inside. That night, I began to feel watched. Every creak in the building seemed amplified, every shadow more threatening. On the 10th night, I was doing my rounds near the stairwell when I heard something, a soft, almost melodic humming coming from the third floor. The third floor had been unused for years. All the rooms were empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. I called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a low sigh. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, flashlight cutting through the gloom. As I reached the hallway, the humming returned, clearer now, like a lullaby. I followed it down the corridor to an open office door. Inside, the room was empty, but the air was thick with cold. I stepped inside and the humming stopped. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. Heart pounding, I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle. It was stuck. I heard the faintest whisper, "Stay." I was finally able to push the door open and sprinted down the stairs. After that, I couldn't sleep. My nights were filled with restless dreams of shadowy figures and sorrowful voices. I even started seeing flashes of a woman in a faded dress standing at the end of the hall, watching me with sad eyes. But whenever I blinked, she was gone. One night, while sitting in the security office, the radio suddenly crackled to life. A voice, barely audible, whispered, "Help me." I froze, my hand trembling over the radio mic. The voice repeated, "Help me." But I didn't know what to do. I researched the building's history and found out that decades ago, a young woman named Alice had worked there. She'd been found dead in the building's basement under mysterious circumstances. The official report called it an accident, but rumors said she had been murdered. I began to feel that Alice's spirit was trapped, trying to reach out. On my last night, the presence became undeniable. The temperature plunged, lights flickered violently, doors slammed throughout the building. I could hear sobbing and faint footsteps everywhere. In the basement, I saw her, Alice, pale and transparent, eyes pleading, mouth-mouthing words I couldn't hear. I felt overwhelming sadness and fear, but also a strange compassion. I whispered, "I'm here. I'm listening." The sobbing grew louder, then slowly faded. The building seemed to exhale, releasing a tension I hadn't realized was there. When morning came, I handed in my resignation. I never returned. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear that faint humming, a sorrowful lullaby carried on the wind. Story the end.